Our first speaker, I think people at Duke will know her very well, Sarah Beckwith. She is the author most recently and relevantly of Shakespeare and the Grammar of Forgiveness. She has contributed articles to many recent volumes on OLP and criticism, including an NLH special issue on feminist investigations and the book Stanley Cavell and Literary Studies, Consequences of Skepticism, edited by Bernie Ree and Richard Eldridge. She's currently working on a book on Shakespeare's late tragedies, Late Have I Loved You, another on versions of Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, which she calls the Book of Second Chances, and an essay on forms of life for a conference organized by one of our speakers, Rob Chodat, on Wittgenstein and criticism. I also want to say that Sarah is she's a member of PAL's steering committee. She's been a supporter of PAL from the start. And in her long stint as chair of English, we concocted many good projects together. Just give us a bit of power and we will run, right? But so she will be the first speaker.
I've given myself a little title. It's called Enter the Child, a Scene from the Claim of Reason. If you can't hear me, just raise your hand. In A Pitch of Philosophy, Cavell says, I might summarize my life in philosophy as directed to discovering the child's voice. The passage I've chosen from chapter 7 of The Claim of Reason exemplifies this discovery. Can this passage shed any light on the implications, conditions, and consequences of Cavell's discovery? Here's the passage. Since it's short, I'm going to read it. And we can also say, when you say, I love my love, the child learns the meaning of the word love and what love is. That, what you do, will be love in the child's world. And if it is mixed with resentment and intimidation, then love is a mixture of resentment and intimidation. And when love is sought, that will be sought. When you say, I'll take you tomorrow, I promise, the child begins to learn what temporal durations are and what trust is. And what you do will show what trust is worth. When you say, put on your sweater, the child learns what commands are and what authority is. And if giving orders is something that creates anxiety for you, then authorities are anxious, authority itself uncertain. Of course, the person growing will learn other things about these concepts and objects also. They will learn gradually as the child's world grows. But all he or she knows about them is what he or she has learned, and all they have learned will be part of what they are. And what will the day be like when the person realizes what he believed about what love and trust and authority are, and how will he stop believing it? What we learn is not just what we have studied, and what we have been taught is not just what we were intended to learn. What we have in our memories is not just what we have memorized. Wow. Nearly 20 years before the publication of The Claim of Reason in 1979, Philippe Arié wrote a book called L'enfant et la vie sous l'Ancien Régime, translated into English as Centuries of Childhood in 1963. He offered us reproductions of portraits from the 16th to the 18th century in which children, at formal feasts or in portraits embodying lineage, property, and possession, gaze out at us like uncanny little adults. These children seem knowing, fully fledged. They look on a world no longer new. The child, claimed Ariès, was not a recognized category or concept in the Middle Ages, coming into existence only in the early modern period. Most historians of childhood have decisively debunked Ariès' claim. Yet the spectre of that uncanny child, imagined and treated as an adult, is a good image of philosophy's amnesia about the child. A few passages before the one I've chosen, Cavell offers this unequivocal indictment. What is wrong, he doesn't very often say things like that, what is wrong is to say what a child is doing as though the child were an adult and not recognize that he is still a child playing, above all growing. Cavell's teacher, Austin, did not populate his philosophy with children. One appears, however, in an appropriately pedagogic context in 3 Ways of Spilling Ink. A schoolmaster asks a pupil who has spilled ink in class, did you do that intentionally? Or did you do that deliberately? Or did you do that on purpose? But the child enters the philosophical investigations in the very first remark, where Wittgenstein begins with Augustine's words from the Confession in his memory of how he first learnt language. His entrance, according to Cavell, haunts the investigations as a whole in the sequence of remarks following Augustine's language lesson in remarks 1, 5, 9, 23, 32 in the famous math lesson, learning how to play Ring a Ring of Roses, learning what pain is, just to mention a few examples of the 50 or so references to playing, training, teaching, practice, and technique. We are asked to remember how we came to know something, the history of our life with words and concepts, including when we did not have them. We're asked to think about the interweaving of words and actions. We're asked to think, therefore, about our dependence on each other, our exemplarity for each other, about the astonishing coincidence of word and world for us, how we were recruited to our culture in the first place, how we recruit others or fail to. Cavell published a set of notes and afterthoughts on the opening remarks of the philosophical investigations in 1995, based on lecture notes he'd delivered at Berkeley in the 1960s and then at Harvard. The original lecture notes, which feature sustained thoughts about Augustine's language lesson in the first remark of the investigations, were, he tells us there, to have started the claim of reason. So we might think of Augustine, Wittgenstein, and Cavell's children as haunting reason's claim from the beginning. The child enters the claim of reason parenthetically on page 77. In the chapter, What a Thing is Called. To what does the child attach the name New York? The child's world contains no cities, close brackets. The child enters, that is, at the very point in which Cavell is exploring the consequential differences between Austinian and Wittgensteinian criteria. Those differences also mark the difference between instruction and initiation. The Austinian difference between a Cooper's hawk and a red-tailed hawk, an eastern phoebe or a blue-grey gnatcatcher. I thought I'd change up the goldcrest and the goldfinch a little bit with some proper ornithology. Between a chanterelle or a northern tooth mushroom, say, might be happily adjudicated by an ornithologist or a mycologist. But Wittgenstein's criteria are invoked for such questions as sitting on a chair, having a toothache, waiting for someone, reading, deciding whether 2 images are the same, etc. Wittgenstein's criteria, moreover, in Cavell's understanding, are disappointing. They depend on our voicing of them to do the work they do, and we may at any point repudiate them, hence the standing threat of skepticism. Of course, initiation may involve instruction, but Cavell's distinction calls our attention to moments of first acquiring words and concepts, and our tendency to misrecognize initiation as instruction. In this failure of acknowledgement, we flatter our own mastery and secure place in the culture. We fail to notice what the child is at any point doing. The passages I've chosen occur in Chapter 7, Part 2, Skepticism in the Existence of the World, a chapter that breaks up an opening and closing sequence on the quest of traditional epistemology. The chapter Cavell calls an excursus, necessary to show why ordinary language philosophy cannot address traditional epistemology as direct criticism, but rather must elucidate the nature of its claims and the context in which they arrive. The chapter contains some of Cavell's most far-ranging and precise writing, at once luminous and compelling. It shows our form of life with words, creatures whose speaking brings the world to the word and the word to the world. It continues the investigations of chapters 4 and 5, What a Thing is Called, and Natural and Conventional. Locally, it tracks several remarks in the philosophical investigations, in particular 31, 30, 32, 120, 371, 65, 66, and 7, and some remarks in part 2. Our mutual understanding rests on nothing more or less than our attunement or agreement in criteria. Cavell glosses and exemplifies Sandra has just beautifully elucidated this. We learn words in certain contexts from the Blue Book. Chapter 7 is an inquiry then into what we call what is learning a word. He's given us a bravura account of how a child, his daughter, learns the word for kitty and for pumpkin. But now what of love, trust, authority, what tomorrow is, what a promise, what betrayal? He begins in the passage with what we can say. The field of possibility and constraint is ourselves, what we are able to say as creatures fated to speech. Augustine's child is single, isolated, stealing language from those around him. For Cavell, the first person plural precedes the first person singular. The second person singular then follows on as address, provocation, invitation. When you say, I love my loves, what follows? You ask to imagine yourself saying it, practicing the love of your loves. It's impossible to separate what you do in loving from what love comes to, what it is in the child's world. Love is only as good as the lover, as Toni Morrison reminded us, so this might be a frightening thought. You learn love not in the first instance from a definition of love, from being told what it is, but from its practice. Definitions, elucidations, expositions, treatises, quaestiones, psychology handbooks, therapy might refine and develop your loving later on. You may learn from Augustine, for example, that the two cities of man and God are constituted by the direction of your loves. From Aquinas, that you cannot love without knowing what you love, but that you cannot know without loving. From Freud, about the harm we repeat in loving. The roots of initiation are never closed to the intimate and public ways you grow in learning to love. You might learn from other tutors and say, falsely, that love is never having to say that you're sorry. Perhaps love for you was mixed with worry, and you could not feel love unless care was shown as such. Perhaps this becomes irksome, and you might one day, but how, learn that you might be loved without such attendant bother and fuss. The call on you is a call on your biography, your memory, your own way with words, how you count, recount, tell, and tally it. In these paragraphs, Cavell gives us examples of loving, promising, and commanding, as if sounding out the grammar of our education, the possibilities of instruction and initiation. Let's take the second expression Cavell is trying out. When you say, I'll take you tomorrow, your child learns what tomorrow is, that she must wait for a time so designated, that tomorrow might come or never come in the fulfillment of a promise. The lesson here is about temporal duration as much as promising. For Cavell, a promise, as he reminds us, is not, as Rawls might have it, an institution, some kind of high road to commitment. To think of it as such is to think of talking as contract-like speech acts, and this is to take too lightly the commitments we enact every time we give our word. Cavell's appeal is to our imaginations and to our capacities for response, but also to our responsibility in assuming or avoiding the positions we take to each other. We take in relation to each other in talking. You do not take on love, trust, and authority as dogmas, and that is why Cavell puts belief in inverted commas in this passage. You do not believe in love, trust, and authority. You live them in various stances of authenticity and awareness. To recognize the child in this, to recognize, therefore, the time before we had acquired the concepts we now have, the time it takes to acquire them, rather than complacently, impatiently even, back projecting those concepts on our smaller selves, is to recognize something in ourselves and our own histories, time, and stories. We act beyond our intentions, beyond our control or mastery, beyond our wishes and wills, and this, too, is part of our natural history. Talking for us is as natural as walking. Wittgenstein, commanding, questioning, recounting, chatting are as much a part of our natural history as walking, eating, drinking, playing. Cavell's language lesson, his scene of instruction, his invitation to a memory of initiation comes to this, quote, instead then of saying either that we tell beginners what words mean or that we teach them what objects are, I will say we initiate them into the relevant forms of life held in language and gathered around the objects and persons of our world. end of quote. For this to happen, we make examples of ourselves and hope our children, actual children, metaphorical ones, can and will follow us. We may not, they may not. Such are the shaky foundations upon which our knowledge and understanding rests. So far, I've tracked the child's entrance in Austen, Wittgenstein, and Cavell's claim of reason, but I used a dramatic metaphor in my title and called these passages scenes of instruction. Cavell uses that term about Wittgenstein's remark 217 at the famous point in the exhaustion of justifications when I turn my spade, having reached bedrock, and feel inclined to say, this is simply what I do. The idea of a scene of instruction is important enough to work its way into the subtitle of the piece, the argument of the ordinary, scenes of instruction in Wittgenstein and in Christi, in Quest of the Ordinary. The idea of a scene draws on something we see, for a scene was anciently a platform on which actors stood in a theatre. And though it can indeed also mean a painting or a picture, it's obviously to be distinguished from what Wittgenstein calls a picture, as in a picture of the essence of human language. I want to draw out the more obviously dramatic idiom of the term, for if a scene begins in the Greek and Latin senses as a location, an architectural place set aside for the purposes of seeing, it also came to denote a section, a part of an act in theatrical form, a piece of action marked off by the entrances and exits of dramatis personae. A scene exists then as a unit of action between designated actors, whose presence points out a stretch of the hurly-burly of action, unpredictably, also here and now. Such a definition emphasizes what we simply do as well as what we see. It draws our attention to the play of voices, such as those described in Cavell's own scene of instruction, which begins with what we can say and what you might say, and goes on to give us a set of embedded voices and quotations of what we might feel inclined to say, what we can possibly say, go on to say, and so on. In this scene, we are all teachers and students, and here's a beautiful quote from Cavell that ends the essay Declining Decline. We're all teachers and students, talkers, hearers, oversayers, hearsayers, believers, explainers. We teach and learn, we learn and teach incessantly, indiscriminately. We are all elders and all children, wanting a hearing for our injustices, for our justices. End of quote. The scene thus recalls us to our human form of life, fated to speech. There's a passage preceding the one Wittgenstein selects to begin the investigations, the passage that is from Augustine. Recall that Augustine has told us fully 7 times before the passage Wittgenstein offers that he does not remember his childhood. He's dependent on what he learns from others and what he sees of children when he's older, such as the jealous baby, pale with bitterness, who glares at his brother at his mother's breast. Before he acquires speech, Augustine's child is imperious, indignant with his elders for their disobedience. He revenges himself upon them by weeping. Augustine's unconverted child is caught between revenge and weeping, between grievance and grief. Compare this child with Wittgenstein's child learning pain. There's obviously so much more to be said about Augustine here, but there's no time for that. But compare this child with Wittgenstein's child learning pain. In answer to the interlocutor's persistent question about how words refer to sensations, Wittgenstein presents us with this possibility. A child has hurt himself and he cries, and then adults talk to him and teach him exclamations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior. The speaker during these sections of the investigations, whose voice we are asked to attend to, for it is a play of voices, is fixated on the gap he feels he can't traverse between words and sensations. Puzzling over the question of reference, he's caught in the bad circle of only these words and the vague, unspecified, but all accompanying sensations. The voice of the ordinary tries to bring the question back to usage and ordinary practice. We talk about sensations every day. But the interlocutor isolates the words and sensations again, fixing on what simply must come between them, get established between them as across a wide, unnavigable gap. The voice of the ordinary returns to our usage and the history, the apprenticeship of how we come to learn things. He tries out this possibility. Words are connected with the primitive, natural expressions of sensations and used in their place. A child has hurt himself and he cries. Then adults talk to him and teach him explanations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior. Does this entail that the word pain actually means crying? No. The verbal expression of pain replaces crying. It does not describe it. All of a sudden, in this primal scene of instruction, we are returned to our natural expressions and natural responsiveness to them. We return to a world with others in it, so that we can learn about pain by the way we talk about it, deal with it, act on it, and respond to each other in the light of it. We get out of the frustrated, static, fruitless, and solitary closed circuit of the interlocutor and his nameless sensation to the most commonplace and familiar of scenes, a scene peopled with children and the elders around them, a social group of adults who care for this crying child and respond to his cries with their actions. The child's life with pain will become more sophisticated. In his life might come incurable pain, or hospitals, nurses, doctors, unwanted anatomy lessons. He might learn not to show his pain in the protection of others, but that will be a suppression of a fully natural response. Wittgenstein wants to remind us of the naturalness of expression, that we can't grow out of that naturalness when we speak. And he returns us to the group gathered around the child, for the child will only learn pain language if those who respond to him, to his pain, see it as expressing pain, and use pain language in response. His first-person use will never happen without their second and third-person use. Where does it hurt? Can't you see she's all bruised? Shall I kiss it better? But the child needs a doctor, surely. From out of the deadly circuit of words and mental objects, we're restored to a group of people talking and responding, exclaiming, succoring, a reminder of our creaturely and natural abilities. Knowing what your pain is entails responding to it rather than wanting to be certain of some surer way than your expression of it. Knowing your pain means acknowledging the call such knowledge imposes upon me for comforting, succoring, healing. Shakespeare's Leontes from The Winter's Tale puts in an appearance in A Conversation of Justice as the skeptic who repudiates criteria, that is to say, loses the ability to tell where speaking is saying what counts. Cavell's extended treatment of The Winter's Tale follows in Quest of the Ordinary, where his highly original treatment of the boy Mamillius stands beside the 6-year-old boy of Wordsworth's Intimation Ode. Cavell pays attention to Mamillius in the play, making you realize how few critics had done so. He notices that Leontes' skepticism and his recovery from it concern his desire for proof that his child is his, from his desire that criteria, the marks of likeness to him, do more than they can do, rather than in jealousy over Hermione. Art thou my boy? It is not a question that Mamillius can answer to calm the spirit in which it has been asked. Neither can anyone in this play. Leontes in this scene has introduced a new game, and it is noticeably unplayful. It's not a game that Mamillius can recognize, and he's puzzled by what seems a trouble, a question, an agitation, and the anxiety the question causes. But he himself his game, and he'll try to play to respond in whatever way he can. Confusion at his father's question appears to cloud in, but they start again. Art thou my calf? Yes, if you will, my lord. It's hardly surprising that Mamillius will seek to secure himself a place in the world as son to his father by saying reassuringly, as if he understands it is his task to comfort, I am like you, they say. Mamillius speaks only a few lines in the play, but he's an important presence in the two scenes in which he appears. In the first scene, Act 1, Scene 2, he is in the force field of his father's desire, and in the next scene, Act 2, Scene 1, he appears in his mother's. Finally pulled away from the one by the other in an attempt to excise the mother's part in him, he dies from conceit and fear about his mother, who is imprisoned, heavily pregnant, accused of adultery and treason. Mamillius is Leontes' surest victim, and his poor frame gives up under the impossibility of being the child of both parents when one seeks to destroy the other. When Leontes says, "Give me the boy," he makes Mamilius hostage to the murderous, irreparable effects of his skeptical doubt and the fertile, deadly imagination in which he breeds fear and suspicion from nothing. His disappearance from the play stands for the cost of Leontes' failure of acknowledgement, and his tutelary spirit pervades the play, not just because the play gets its title from the tale whispered into the ears of his mother, a sad tale's best for winter, but also because the play so vitally concerns questions of inheritance, of initiation. It is an intergenerational romance. What is at stake are the relations of adults and children, and the anxiety of that relation in a culture which doesn't know what it has to pass on, and a younger generation that has been brutally disinherited and so does not know what to call its own. Polixenes and Leontes have prelapsarian fantasies about their boyhoods, so this is also a play about what it means for adults to grow up and the anxieties that entails. The unredeemed death of Mamilius haunts the play's resurrections and reunions. It asks us if childhood then and now is a place for children, if there is a place for tears that are not revengeful, if telling can be separated from retaliation. Cavell's attention to Mamilius asks us what can be recovered of childhood, whether the child can play, his latency respected, and whether the grown-up child in that tale and Augustine's child, the child of our misrecognitions and projections, might come to his inheritance of language rather than stealing it from his elders, a stranger in a strange land. In this sense, the child for Cavell concerns our hospitality to ourselves and to the small strangers in our midst. André Malraux, in his Anti-Mémoire, asks a priest what he has learnt from a lifetime of confessing his parishioners. He replies that people are much more unhappy than one thinks. And then, here Malraux describes the priest raising his brawny lumberman's arms in the starlit night, and then the fundamental fact that there is no such thing as a grown-up person. In beginning with the confession, Wittgenstein and Cavell invite us to such acknowledgements, tasking philosophy with the education of grown-ups.